Hey everybody, Michael Tracey here. Wow, this is a big one. So I did a long, comprehensive debate slash discussion with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. Some of you may know that I was employed by the Young Turks between 2017 and 2018. Spent around a year and a half there total. Did a lot of work that I'm very much proud of and that I think holds up, but throughout my tenure, there was always this running tension or at least disagreement between myself and most of the people who worked at the Young Turks, especially Cenk. And he's the figurehead, he's a founder. So that disagreement was very much at the forefront. And the disagreement was over Trump Russia. We had basically diametrically opposite views on almost every aspect of the story. And we even publicly debated on the Young Turks' main show at one point in March of 2017. People can go back and look at that video. I was significantly heavier then, so I don't look great, but I think my arguments, again, hold up. Either way, since the Mueller finding came out around 2 weeks ago, there's been a lot of heated debate on this subject, and I brought up some of the more notable moments from my Young Turks stint as it relates to the disagreement between myself and Cenk. And very much to their credit, Zed Jelani and Leighton Woodhouse facilitated a long-form podcast discussion between myself and Cenk. And I was very happy to engage in that. And also, I'm very pleased that they allowed me to post my own version of the podcast on my podcast and on YouTube. So thanks to them for that. Please subscribe to their podcast. It's called Extremely Offline. It should come up in Google. And let's get into it.
What do you think that what do you think that basically the Democrats got wrong? Because you seem to be on the side being more critical of sort of the standard Russia-Trump collusion narrative.
Yes, that is accurate. First, I want to say thank you to Cenk sincerely for doing this. I appreciate it. Also want to thank Zed and Leighton for setting it up. And I also want to just preface by saying I've expressed this to Cenk privately, and I've also expressed it publicly, which is that I was very grateful to have the opportunity that I did at the Young Turks for the year and a half or so that I worked there. Cenk, very much to his credit, gave me virtual autonomy to do whatever I wanted, which included a lot of journalism and analysis that was skeptical of the prevailing Trump-Russia narrative. And I'm sure there were many points at which people within TYT, maybe even Cenk himself, had preferred that I would do something else. And no restrictions were ever imposed on me. And I still look very much fondly on my time there. So I just wanted to say that off the bat. I think, and Zed, reel me back in if I'm not addressing your initial prompt sufficiently, but I think that one reason why this conversation with Cenk is so fruitful, or should be, is because, as you mentioned, a lot of the fallout from this Mueller finding or the Barr letter around 2 weeks ago now, it's been extremely contentious on social media. There's a lot of pent-up frustration around this issue. Cenk and I had public debates on air on the Young Turks about it. We talked about it privately. There's been many fissures, I would say, on the progressive left around this issue. And when kind of translated through social media, that can get very rancorous. So this is a very good forum, I would say, to do that. And just, I guess, to begin and make an assertion that Cenk hopefully can respond to is that, one of the things that I view as so tragic about all this is that progressive media in particular, and this is something that Aaron Maté and I have spoken about on my podcast and other forums, is that progressive media, in large part, seem to very much parrot the establishment narratives around this story from the outset. And by establishment narratives, I mean, vaguely speaking, Trump is somehow compromised by Russia. He's an asset or agent of Putin. He's engaged in collusion or collusive activity with Russia that empowered him and enabled him to get into the White House. And that as president, he's allowed Russia or Putin, it's never clear what's actually being alleged for the most part, is somehow directing the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. And to me, all that has never been anywhere near amply established. And in fact, it seems like the opposite has always been pretty clear from the outset. So to me, it was very tragic to have the Young Turks, Democracy Now!, Mother Jones, other outlets that are associated with the progressive left in the media world, basically just fall in line with this narrative and maybe put a different spin on it now and then, but march in lockstep more or less with like MSNBC and CNN. So that was really disconcerting to me. And that's basically how I wanted to just introduce this discussion.
So Cenk, I have a question for you. It's actually going to be a question for both of you, but just before we jump into a lot of the things that Michael raised, which we'll have plenty of time to do, just to sort of establish some factual common ground. So since the Mueller report has not been made public yet, we're all sort of operating in the dark as to what the details are of its findings. We do know that there was not enough evidence to press a collusion charge. Other than that, we don't know much. We know that members of Mueller's team have begun to soft pedal the Barr summary. So are we all in agreement on just two basic things? Number one, that it seems that there was probably not collusion. And number two, that we cannot yet say whether there was obstruction or not.
No. So this is at the heart of the discussion. And this is why I think my position needs to be really clarified and distinct from the MSNBCs of the world, and is probably a fairly unique position, if anything could be fairly unique. And the Young Turks position is different altogether. So first, to Michael's point, the Young Turks position is that it doesn't have a position. It has a lot of different hosts. And people have been yelling at me that how could you let Jimmy Dore say X, Y, or Z, or Michael Tracey, or you name it, or Michael Schur, or Ben Mankiewicz. And we call ourselves homo progressives. And if you don't like diversity of opinion on the left, sad day for you. So that's what we do. And I'm proud to have all those people on the network from all the different ranges. And I'm proud that we never shut down any of their voices. In terms of my position, as opposed to the Young Turks position, and as opposed to MSNBC, I believe that there is collusion, but that is not centered around the election. And so I think that the Democratic Party and MSNBC were obsessed with proving collusion in the election because they're obsessed with their beloved Hillary Clinton's loss. And so if I say that on MSNBC, I'd be removed from air. Oh, right, I was. So for saying things along those lines in earlier issues. And so so if you want to posit, Leighton, that Mueller's report largely concludes that there was no collusion around the election, yes, I agree. But I would not extend that to no collusion with the Russians at all, which is a massively important distinction.
And Leighton, let's just be clear about something, okay? In the Barr letter, Barr directly quoted from Mueller on the collusion aspect of all this. And Barr said, quoting Mueller, so this is Mueller's proactive proclamation, that they did not establish any conspiracy or coordination, which are basically words that amount to collusion, between Trump associates, and Russia. Okay, that's what was established by Mueller as per Barr. Now, if you're just saying that Barr made up a quote, then I think you're probably packing conspiracies on top of conspiracies at this point. Right. So
let me be clear then, Michael. Yeah. So it appears, and that's why we don't know why Leighton's prefaces was so important, that Mueller perceived his remit to be the election and only the election. Now, if he made that mistake, I understand why. There was enormous pressure from the Republicans to not, quote unquote, cross a red line, as they put it, of looking into Trump's financial ties to the Russians or any business interest that he had. So if Mueller did not do that, then no, he hasn't proven that there isn't any collusion, period. He just proved that there wasn't one around the election. If he did do that, if he said, hey, you know what? I looked into his past ties with the Russians and all the money that they gave the Trump Tower and the 63 other billionaires, Russian billionaires that gave Trump money or invested in his properties, and concluded that it really was no money laundering, and Trump didn't know the Russians anything, then I would say, okay, well, Mueller's a super professional prosecutor, and they had a long time to look at it, and I'll come around to that point of view that there apparently wasn't money laundering or collusion in any way. But right now, as far as we know, he didn't touch that at all, and we really don't know whether he did or not.
Cenk, that's just not accurate. Okay, and I want to be as respectful throughout this conversation as humanly possible. Okay, but that's just not factually accurate. Mueller's mandate was extremely broad. If you look at the authorization of the special counsel written by Rod Rosenstein in May 2017, the broadness is specified. Mueller's mandate is defined as, quote, to investigate any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump, and any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation, which essentially means that Mueller has incredibly broad discretion to investigate virtually anything. And you know how that's been demonstrated? They ended up charging Manafort with crimes that dated back to 2005 that have to do with tax and bank fraud, which have nothing to do with the 2016 election. And the judges presiding over the cases in which those crimes were tried made abundantly clear that they were never even positing that any of this had any relevance or bearing on the 2016 election. So when you're saying that Mueller only investigated stuff having to do specifically with the 2016 election, that's just wrong. And we know that for a whole host of reasons. Again, one being what Manafort was charged with. So again, his purview was expansive. So the theory that you've alleged all along is that there's some corrupt deal between Trump and Russia that may not have had something specifically to do with the 2016 election, although I have quotes from you, including from our debate that we had on air about this in March 2017, when you said that, quote, that Trump and Russia definitely had some sort of corrupt deal, and that this deal, quote, helped swing the 2016 election. So you were positing that there was some collusive activity that had bearing on the 2016 election, right? But either way, everything that you've alleged having to do with some kind of corrupt relationship between Trump and Russia would have absolutely fell within Mueller's investigative mandate. And the fact that he took the step proactively and affirmatively to say that this did not happen is clear indication that everything you've been positive, again, with all due respect, has just not panned out factually.
Yeah, so I totally disagree. And I'll be proven right about this. So I'm glad to have you on the record on it. They looked into Manafort's previous crimes. Why? Because they wanted to get leverage on him so that he would flip on Trump and see if Trump had done anything during the election. To me, that's super clear and obvious. Not because they had the most expansive mandate there is, but because that is what prosecutors do. They get you on other crimes, which creates leverage for them to get information from you about this crime. The Republicans said over and over again, and the media, in their infinite stupidity as usual, and probably a point that we could agree on, insisted that there was a red line, that you could not look into Trump's business ties. Now, here's the part I am most insistent on, which is that we do not know. Nobody's read the Mueller report. There's no indication that the Mueller report looked into money laundering, not one shred of evidence to that. So that's why I say I'm glad you're on the record here. So if it turns out Mueller did not look into Trump's earlier business ties with the Russians, then I guess you'll come out and say you were 100% wrong about that, right, Michael?
Here's what I'm saying. You just asserted that we know that Mueller didn't investigate anything outside the confines of the 2016 election. That's just not true. And we know that because...
Here, Michael, I'm not asserting that.
So what are you asserting?
That we don't know whether he did or not. If you remember,
we do know.
Finish. Earlier in this conversation, I said, if he did look into it and he said, oh, turns out I investigated and there was no money laundering, I will accept that.
Okay, but we do know that he investigated a wide range of potentially criminal activity that was outside the scope merely of the 2016 election, right? As demonstrated by the Manafort charges that stemmed back a full decade prior.
I just explained that. That's to gain leverage. I worked as a prosecutor. It's prosecutor 101. That's what you do.
Okay, but whether it was to gain leverage or for any other reason, we know that he did investigate matters that were outside the scope of the 2016 election.
Only in the case of Manafort, as far as we know.
Well, that's not necessarily true either, because Gates, the Manafort associate, who's also been charged, I mean, he has been implicated in matters that also don't strictly pertain to the 2016 election. So again, that's also not true. I mean, and additionally, Cenk, I mean, you did. So you've sort of backtracked now as the evidence is just insurmountable and you can't repeat the things that you repeated over and over again for over 2 years. But you did say that there was, again, here's a quote from the March 2017 debate that we did live on the Young Turks. People can go back and watch it. You said, quote, "There's definitely some sort of corrupt deal," end quote. And this deal, you said, had, quote, "helped swing the 2016 election." So you were positing collusion as it relates to the 2016 election, correct?
So let me be clear about two things there. One is there a corrupt deal that is affecting Trump to this day? I believe there is, and I have not changed my mind on that at all, nor have I been proven wrong about that at all. So that's a debate that I'm happy to have. On the issue of whether it affected the election, I think you make actually a pretty decent point. And I saw one of your tweets and went back and conceded this, that, like, for example, I talk about the servers and that happened during the election, the server in Pennsylvania. And so there's good evidence of that. And I'm super curious whether Mueller looked into that. So the server of Trump's in Pennsylvania is pinged largely by Alpha Bank in Russia. We don't know what the pings are. And the rest of the pings come from the DeVos family. That is incredibly curious. And I can't wait to see if Mueller talked about it. If he didn't look into it, God damn it, then this report is not at all what we were expecting. If he did look into it and says, hey, look, you know what? That was just for whatever reason, the facts on that were wrong, then I accept that. And it is what it is, right? So I did talk about it in regards to the election in some ways. And
let's just clarify what exactly you're referring to there so people are aware.
Let me finish real quick.
Okay, sure.
You can see that the heart of our debates and what I have said throughout in these last 2 years, and what I have maniacally zeroed in on and focused on, is the collusion list dealing with the money laundering that Trump has had with the Russians.
Well, hold on a second, because you referenced the October 16th, 2018 segment that you did, right? That had to do with this Alpha Bank server. And I just want to inform everybody that the title of that segment posted on YouTube was, quote, proof in all caps, Trump campaign colluded with Russia. That was the title of the video.
You guys got to get past this. So I want the audience to understand. Hold on. I want the audience to understand super clearly, because this is the number one misunderstanding online. Everybody's putting what they want to hear into the word collusion. So when you guys say collusion, you usually mean collusion during the elections, which I am saying now, based on what Barr's summary of the Mueller report, I agree with you guys that it appears that Mueller could not prove that, right? But when I say collusion, I largely mean, and that's why I asked you, you know that the heart of what I've been saying for 2 years is collusion with the Russians in every aspect, including money laundering. And the part that's most controversial, and that we'll have the most actual disagreement on, is while he's in office. And so I know that that'll make your head explode, and it has, but I believe that he's definitely taking orders from the Russians. But that
but Cenk, and again, I understand and acknowledge that you've also talked about collusion in different respects relating to financial dealings and money laundering and so forth. But I have to just emphasize, in that October 16th, 2018 clip, you said that the story you were commenting on constituted, quote, conclusive proof that there was collusive coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election, not after, not having to do with financial dealings, during the election. And you acknowledge that that's wrong?
No. because I don't know what the Mueller report says. So here's what I mean by that. If the Mueller report, as I just told you earlier, looked into the server and concluded that there was nothing there, then I will concede that. But if they didn't look into it, then I concede nothing because no one investigated it. So, and we don't know that right now. So, in terms of the server, guys, the reason I say that it is conclusive, if the server story is true, and there seems to be at the time and even to this day, every indication that it is true, the Trump explanation was, oh, it was random marketing spam. And it just so happened that 80% of the pings to our server that we hid in Pennsylvania came from Alpha Bank in Russia, and 18% came from the DeVos family, who I later named to a cabinet post and sent her brother, Eric Prince, to a secret meeting with the Russians after my election at Seychelles Island. And that was all random spam. It is not, and you would have to be maniacally stupid to think that it was. The only way that that story is not true and not relevant is if the facts are wrong. And so that I have an open mind on. But if those facts are correct, then I do not back away from that assertion 1%.
Okay, but Cenk, if Mueller had access to smoking gun evidence that there was a collusive relationship, an illegal conspiratorial relationship between Trump associates and Russia, and he just didn't pursue the lead, then he's got to be one of the most incredible incompetents in American history, right? No. So how could he not have pursued that if it was open to him? I mean, I went back and looked at the video that you and John Iadarola, sorry, I mispronounced his name. Okay, sorry, did on May 17th, 2017, when the special counsel was initiated by Rod Rosenstein, and you touted it as, quote, great news. You were saying that Mueller is a great choice for this. He would do a competent job, and you were, quote, very excited by the Mueller appointment. You even went so far as to sing the na 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 hey goodbye song in relation to Trump, because you thought that it was going to be the beginning of the end of Trump. And in fact, on many occasions, you predicted that Trump would be out of office in a matter of months. Yep.
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just piggyback off that question, Cenk? I'm going to let you answer it, but just to add to that, so Michael had said, had referred to illegal collusive activity. When you're talking about non-election collusion, are you? And the answer might be that you don't know because the Mueller report hasn't been released yet, but are you referring to run-of-the-mill corruption around building the Moscow Tower, which may or may not be illegal, or are you talking about illegal money laundering, which may or may not have been toward the campaign and towards his presidential run?
No, I'm definitely talking about illegal money laundering that Trump has been doing with the Russians for a very long time. That is based on openly public available evidence, seems incredibly clear. So we'll get to that discussion in a second. But in terms of the Mueller's integrity, et cetera, again, Michael, as I said earlier in just this conversation, I don't question Mueller's integrity at all. So you keep positing that if he didn't cover something, it must be because he's either crooked or incompetent. And I don't think that that's a fair supposition at all. I think that the most likely answer is he felt tremendous pressure from the Republicans, which is what we have seen in our entire lifetimes. They bully and they put overwhelming pressure on everybody in Washington to do as they instruct. And their instructions in this case was, you better not look at anything that didn't have to do with the election. If you do witch hunt, I mean, they called it a witch hunt either way, Trump did, but the rest of the Republicans were super clear in roaring that it should not be looking into his business ties. I had thought and hoped that he would anyway, because he's such a professional prosecutor, and that, well, look, if you're looking into why Trump might be working with the Russians, it's crazy not to look into his business ties. But Michael, we're having kind of an academic conversation about that because we're going to find out soon enough if he did or if he didn't. So I think we should probably move past that, because if he did and he found him to be innocent, then I'll come out and say I was wrong. I don't know if you acknowledge that if he says he didn't, that you would acknowledge that you were wrong that he covered that, or your assumption that he covered that. But we'll find out. So we should talk about the things that we disagree with that's already in the public.
Well, hold on a second, Cenk, because there's no evidence at this point that Mueller succumbed to any kind of Republican pressure. And here's why. Mueller had the full U.S. Treasury behind him for 22 months. He had a team that comprised some of the most aggressive prosecutors in the United States. They issued all manner of subpoenas and search warrants and requests from foreign intelligence services. They brought in for questioning people who were only just tangentially associated with Trump and had them rack up enormous legal fees, dominated their lives for 2+ years, arguably even entrapped some people. So this idea that Mueller just kind of slinked away and didn't pursue any and all possible leads, there's just no evidence that suggests that. There's every reason to believe that he was extremely aggressive in pursuing almost every lead imaginable. So yes, is it theoretically possible that he didn't pursue some smoking gun evidence as it relates to 2016 election collusion? I guess sure, it's possible, but again, there's no reason to believe that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, you're going on a limb to hurt your own position for no reason. You just don't know that. Are you claiming that Republicans put no pressure on Mueller to stay within the election? That you can't possibly claim that. Are you saying that Mueller is such a superhuman that he's that kind of pressure is impenetrable for him? There's no reason to believe that. And Mueller's a Republican. I'm not saying that taints his investigation, but I am saying that him being susceptible to overwhelming Republican pressure would be very normal in Washington. Barack Obama fired somebody in his own administration because he was afraid of what Glenn Beck would say. I mean, generally Washington cowers from the bullies in the Republican Party. That's super obvious. But again, we're going to find out. Just let him release the report and we'll see if he covered business ties or if he didn't, if he covered the server or if he didn't.
Well, Michael, I want to get in here real quick because, I think we're going back and forth over the content of the report, the scope of the investigation. But I think one reason, Cenk maybe had brought up some suspicion about Trump and Russia, and a lot of people have this suspicion, is because of Trump's behavior in certain aspects. And I do feel like we may need a compelling explanation for some of his behavior in certain aspects, and that's why people were looking so much at this investigation. I mean, when he had the last press conference with Vladimir Putin, that was probably the most friendly meeting between a Russian leader and an American leader in American history. He's been very, very laudatory towards Putin, and that does suggest that there has to be some explanation towards it. That's very unusual, particularly for a Republican. I mean, Democrats tend to be a little bit friendlier to Russia historically, although right now that may not be the case. What is the explanation in your mind for some of that kind of bromance between Trump and Putin? If there's just not everything is on the level there.
First of all, I think this notion that Trump has been inordinately friendly with Putin is extremely overblown. And I also don't even necessarily accept the premise that his meetings have been the friendliest of any U.S. president meeting with Russian leaders. Go back to Reagan's meeting with Gorbachev. They were extremely chummy and friendly, and they had all kinds of private encounters for the purpose of achieving mutually suitable diplomatic objectives. Obama had a number of meetings with Medvedev, for example, when he was the president for a time and Putin was still in power, that were not just cordial, but again, friendly. I mean, this idea that Trump is always suspiciously laudatory of Putin, I think, is just a product of this confabulated media narrative that everybody's just kind of accepted without sufficient scrutiny. So I actually went and watched the clip from the Young Turks the day of that Helsinki summit when the media was in meltdown. John Brennan was on Twitter, screaming that Trump was a traitor, and then everybody seemed to be running around with their heads on fire. And here are just a couple of quotes from that video from Cenk. Cenk said at that press conference, Trump had been, quote, cucked by Putin,
yep,
and Russia had, quote, taken away our democracy, end quote, and that all this was evidence that Putin, quote, controlled Trump. So there's Cenk asserting a version of the Manchurian candidate theory that he's trying to distance himself from as it relates to what's expressed on MSNBC and so forth. I mean, that's just a half step away from Rachel Maddow. It may just be Rachel Maddow. So this idea that Cenk didn't buy into the mainstream narratives, I think, is wholly unsupported by the evidence. Putin is not controlling the United States government, Cenk. The U.S. policy has not been subverted by the Kremlin. We have too many pieces of evidence now that flatly contradict that premise to make it in any way tenable. I hope you'd reevaluate that.
Nope, I don't reevaluate it. And so important distinctions here. If you're going to criticize me for saying that Trump is controlled by the Russians and you don't agree with that, that is a fair criticism, because I probably believe that more than anyone, maybe even more than Rachel does. I've called him the Siberian candidate many times, and I still believe that. But the distinction that's important is the Rachel Maddows of the world and the Democratic Party view it as like, oh, we would have won if it wasn't for those dastardly Russians. That's not the main reason Hillary Clinton lost. It isn't because of 4 million Twitter impressions, which is what someone gets in a week. It's not to say that Russia didn't interfere in the elections. They did, and Mueller has reported and concluded that. I'm curious whether you acknowledge that, because you have a certain love for what you think the Mueller report said. So I wonder if you also love that it said, yes, there was definitely Russian interference in the election. I happen to think that the Russian interference in the election was real, but not nearly as important as the MSNBCs of the world make it out to be. And that's why I think it's important to distinguish me from them, because I'm not making excuses for Hillary Clinton. And I don't think that that's anywhere near the main issue in the election. Now, having said that this is the heart of our disagreement. I think Trump is absolutely controlled by Putin. And I know that you think the exact opposite. And so at that press conference, Mr. Alpha Male that loves to go around literally pushing people aside at NATO meetings and other ally meetings was bowing down to Putin. Putin is right about that. If our intelligence says something, no way, Putin's right. Putin's right. Putin's right. I mean, come on, Michael. It's as if you're purposely putting blinders on. So if you were to make the case that American foreign policy towards Russia has been complicated and mixed in the Trump administration, that'd actually be a pretty good case. And that's a fascinating conversation. If you're saying you don't see how Trump is being deferential to Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin, I think you're going to lose every sane, rational person, because we could all see it with our eyes. And so that brings us to the translators, right? I mean, to take away not only every American official from meetings with Vladimir Putin, which once happened with Reagan and Gorbachev at the most sensitive negotiations around nuclear war, but otherwise is unprecedented, but to also take away the American translators, their notes, and to rip it out of their hands, and then to make sure that there are no more American translators allowed into his meetings with Vladimir Putin while he's president. That is so bewildering. And any rational person would say, wow, there's something really weird about that. But for you to claim, no, that's perfectly normal, nothing weird about it, no, super normal, it's just, you lose all credibility.
Cenk, here's what's been so frustrating and maddening about this for not just me, but Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and I'm not citing them to give myself credibility by association. Obviously, they're far more established and accomplished than me, and also, considerably older, so they've just done a lot more stuff. And so I in no way want to just cite them as somehow, make appeals to authority by invoking them. But one thing that the three of us, and also Aaron Mate, who I know you've had on, and you also had Glenn on this past week, so I commend you for that. But one thing that we've been so frustrated about from the outset here is that we have a journalistic impulse, right? So we are always operating on the basis of what evidence is in the offing. Whereas it seems like you and so many others throughout the media have always operated on the basis of what you have in the past many times described as your, quote, hunch, which is basically just innuendo, baseless assertions of causation, and stuff that doesn't necessarily amount to any kind of factual predicate for what it is that you're asserting. So this notion that Trump's performance at that press conference was automatically evidence that the government has been subverted by a Manchurian candidate. I mean, that's it's hard to even encapsulate into words
But that's
how
not what I
ridiculous
said,
that
Michael.
is. That makes
That's not
no
what I
sense. It's
said.
not fact-based. It's emotion-based. And I would hope that people
That's
in the media
totally
who
not
are in some kind of journalistic or quasi-journalistic capacity would step back, not react emotionally, and say that Putin, Trump has been, quote, cucked, not invoke all this kind of inflammatory language that, again, has no basis in reality. You want to know what some facts are, Cenk? You say that I'm ignoring facts. Here are some facts. Trump has sent lethal arms to Ukraine in contradiction to that Republican platform in 2016 that everybody said was evidence that he was in hock to the Kremlin. So he's done that. He's violated his own campaign pledge and taken a belligerent action toward Putin that he campaigned on the opposite of. He's trying to overthrow Putin's chief ally in the Western Hemisphere in the form of Venezuela. He tore up the INF Treaty and is escalating a nuclear arms race. Tulsi Gabbard has talked about this constantly, and I agree with her 100% when she says that the political climate that's been fostered in the United States has served to create a set of incentives on Trump that are perverse, in that they've given him the belief that it's in his political advantage to demonstrate how, quote, tough he is on Putin and take all these belligerent actions, whether it's bombing repeatedly Putin's chief client state in the Middle East in the form of Syria, whether it's personally intervening to tell Angela Merkel that she better not purchase natural gas from Russia, which is one of their main economic lifelines. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So for you to ignore those facts and then to just use your emotional response to this ultimately somewhat trivial performance in Helsinki, it's absolutely insane.
Okay, no, you're totally mischaracterizing. So, but that's why we have this conversation, so we can speak for ourselves. So, first of all, I don't minimize those things. I now talk to Aaron Mate and Glenn Greenwald and acknowledged that it's, and in fact, I did it earlier in this conversation, that the Trump administration's foreign policy record on Russia has been mixed. You, of course, conveniently left out all the things that were super helpful to Russia, which I'll get into in a second. I'm being honest and acknowledging that it is mixed, especially like the German pipeline. That's a direct interest of Russia. And I said that Trump was doing that, I was like, wow, okay, that's interesting evidence on the other side, because we actually look at the facts, no matter what our theories are, and honestly deal with those facts. So, but when you say that you try to frame it as his performance in Helsinki is somehow like the main driving force for my theories, I don't know if it's purposely misleading or just, you've just got it wrong, honestly. But no, that is a tiny, tiny part of it. The things that I care most about are the things that are inexplicable. So why so the Trump kids say, for example, that we got all of our money from the Russians, and they say they financed all of our golf courses because they really like golf. Okay, only a stupid person would believe that. Do we acknowledge that? Do we agree on that?
I mean, Cenk, I'm just going by your own words. People can go watch the video from July 16th, 2018, when you said the Helsinki press conference was evidence of the theory that Trump was, quote, controlled by Putin.
Yeah.
So whatever importance you assign to it relative to other factors, you can elaborate that on that for yourself.
Yeah.
You did cite it as evidence for the theory of the Manchurian candidate thing, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
So it is a small piece of evidence. I was going through the large evidence, but I can't get you to concede anything, which again makes you seem doctrinarian. Obviously, the Russians did not give money to all of Trump's golf courses because they really like golf. Every rational person understands that. So that doesn't mean that they did money laundering, but it does raise an eyebrow. 63 different Russian billionaires invested into Trump properties. Russians bought about a third of Trump Tower as he was about to go bankrupt there. They would buy property at extremely inflated prices and then sell them at lower prices. These are all telltale signs of money laundering. Does it prove it conclusively in a court of law? No, and I have made that clear. But does it make you think that perhaps that's what's happening here? Yes, that is clear, obvious evidence that that is something that should be looked into and something that is concerning. Then he wins the election and he sends Eric Prince to do a secret meeting with the Russians in Seychelles Island. That is extraordinary and incredibly weird. If you don't acknowledge that that's weird, then I wonder if you have an agenda. Whereas I look at the things that they did, like arming the Ukrainians and being opposed to the Russian pipeline into Germany, and I go, well, that's interesting proof to the counter of my theory, and I wonder how it all shakes out. So then you get to the taking away of the translator notes and making sure that the translators are not in the meetings with Vladimir Putin. And then you get into the sanctions. And so this is the heart of why I think, and this is the conversation that I had with Glenn just a couple of days ago. So why would Trump do those things that are not all in favor of Russian foreign policy, but be so insistent on not wanting to do the sanctions? It is because the thing that the Russian oligarchs care most about is, unsurprisingly, their money. And the sanctions are at the core of their financial interest and potentially their financial ties to Trump. And hence, Trump says, I do not want to do the sanctions under any condition. He loses. The Senate passes it 98-2. He says, I don't want to sign this, but I'm forced to sign it. After he signs it, he will not implement it for an extraordinarily long period of time, finally forced to enact it. And then the Treasury Department recently lifted some sanctions in an outrageous move. So these are all evidence, and fascinating evidence, and ones that I'm curious what you think of. That, yes, there is some sort of deal between Trump and Russia, but it seems like whenever we talk about those facts that are in the public domain already, you come back with you're being emotional, which is an obviously loaded term, right? And you come back with no concessions that there is anything untoward here, and you say it's perfectly normal. And again, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, because unless you're as blinded as you are on this issue, most people that'll look at this will go, well, look, those are interesting points and they should be addressed, and that does look weird.
It's funny that you could accuse me of being blinded on this issue when there's a clip circulating on Twitter that I actually had forgotten about from 2017, where you said people like Michael Tracey have, quote, blinders on, and they're going to have egg on their faces when Trump is marched out of the White House in handcuffs, whereas I, Cenk, am going to be proven correct. But let's just be clear about one thing. You are positing a Manchurian candidate conspiracy theory. You are positing something that is extraordinary on its face, mind-boggling, to the point that it has no precedent in all of American history. So the burden of proof is on you to establish why that theory is justified. It's not on me as a, quote, skeptic. I'm not positing any theory. That burden of proof is on you, and you fail to establish that. So if you're asking me to concede some things, okay, here's what I can concede. There are individual Russians, some of whom are, quote, oligarchs, although I note that wealthy American billionaires are never called oligarchs, but that's a separate issue.
I call them oligarchs.
Okay, well, I give you credit for that. Why did Occam's razor tells me that, wealthy Russians who are attracted to the, quote, Trump brand because he's gaudy, because he had a reality TV show for over a decade, because he's been a mainstay of American cultural life for a long time, probably thought to themselves, yeah, maybe I'll buy some condos at Trump properties because that'll get me in good with these Americans who maybe I have some business interests in and who I want to impress. And I'll do the same with regard to the golf courses. To me, that's a much more plausible explanation for that stuff than any kind of collusive conspiracy or something that ended up swinging the election or whatever the ultimate theory is. And I also note that it's never clear what is actually being asserted. Like, what does this all amount to? Is it and when you say collusion, I mean, what do all these kind of disparate facts that you're dot connecting and weaving together actually mean in the aggregate? Is it that he's controlled by the Kremlin? I mean, I guess you've said variations of that, but again, it's not been in evidence in terms of the policies that Trump has actually carried out. His policies have been much more aggressive and antagonistic toward Russia than Obama. Okay, so that being the case, you have to ignore that factual record to go on with this extraordinary, like a deranged Rachel Maddow theory that again, I just think you say I'm doing a disservice. I think you're doing a disservice to your progressive viewers by telling them time after time for 2+ years that there's a Manchurian candidate in the White House. And that's led them to the conclusion that in order to oppose this Manchurian candidate, they have to buy into this most maximalist conspiratorial version of the conspiracy. So when I was at the Young Turks, I went around to all these town halls, and we actually discussed this on air, where people from groups like Indivisible and Move On and other liberal activist groups were showing up to these town halls, waving around signs saying Trump is a traitor, Trump is controlled by Russia, waving like Soviet iconography and stuff, chanting treason, treason, treason over and over again. This is what the Democratic base and progressives also have been obsessed by for 2+ years. And you know why they've been obsessed by it? Because people they view as having authority have been telling them to be obsessed by it. And I'm sorry to say, Cenk, but that includes you.
Well, Michael, I want to. First of all, we have to remember that we're discussing the ideas here. We're discussing competing theories of this. There's a lot of people who hold both theories. So one, I think we need to take the tone down a little bit in that regard.
Well, I agree. But you know what? I'm trying to be as calm and measured as possible. But I do feel like I have legitimate anger on this topic because of the damage that I believe it's done. So if my voice is raised, I apologize, but just know that it's not because of any kind of personal grudge or petty thing. I have extraordinary respect for Cenk. Okay, so that's why I'm so troubled by not just Cenk, but the others that I've respected having gone down this conspiracy rabbit hole and done a vast disservice to the people that they're supposed to serve.
So look, I appreciate that, and I'm not one to be like obsessed with civility. I think it's okay to get animated. I don't know if anybody's watched the Young Turks. I get animated from time to time. So Michael, I don't mind that. And look, we've both said a couple of things here that are a little charged. And of course it's a little personal. Let's keep it real too. You feel like you were vindicated, and so it's not that you're a little worried about the ramifications, or maybe a lot worried, to be fair to you, right? But, you feel like everybody called you crazy, and now you feel like you're vindicated. So it's a little personal in that sense. It's okay. And you're saying, hey, I led to hyping people up in the wrong direction. And that sounds personal, but that is your true belief, and that's okay. And if I did, and it was really problematic, it's okay to air it out. So I don't mind.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Well, I do have a question though. I think something that a lot of people have pointed out about President Trump is that he's very impressionable. He tends to like anyone who flatters him. When he visited Saudi Arabia, they would put up billboards with his tweets under the theory that this would make him like them more, and that, so on and so forth. I think, Michael, you have acknowledged that Russia did try to do something in 2016 campaign. We don't know how much impact it had. I think probably everyone in this episode kind of agrees that probably didn't have an enormous impact, but they did try to do something. Don't you at least, Michael, have a concern that because Russia did seem to sort of side with Trump in the election, that its leadership spent a lot of time praising Trump, that they are playing the same games that the Israelis or the Saudis or the Emirates are playing, where they basically they pump up his ego, and that might make him a little bit more malleable to where he did say things like he trusts Putin on the election hacking issue over his own intelligence service, which is a very odd thing to say, but it might make sense under the framework of thinking, well, these people helped me in the election, so maybe they kind of like me, so maybe I should like them too. I mean, just from that pure psychological point of view, isn't there something a little unsettling that maybe that explains some of Trump's behavior or his statements?
Well, number one, I don't think it would be shocking or surprising at all if the top tier of the Russian government, in this case Putin or Medvedev, had a preference for Trump over Clinton in 2016. You know why? Because Hillary Clinton was constantly railing against Russia as this, quote, she called it the, quote, grand godfather of global extremism, and she was asserting all kinds of conspiracy theories about the nefarious worldwide influence of Russia. Now, did it have a kernel of truth? Has the Russian government given state banks or whatever, given loans to certain, quote unquote, fringe political figures in various countries? Yeah, I think it's plausible. But Hillary Clinton was touting how hawkish and aggressive she would be vis-a-vis Russia, whereas Trump was saying, let's get along with Russia, let's have something that resembles a détente. And in fact, if you go back and look at 2012, when Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney, they expressed the same view about Obama. They expressed a pro-Obama view. And you know why? Because Romney was running around saying that Russia's our chief geopolitical foe. So no, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would have had a preference. And you mentioned that they interfered or they did something in 2016. Okay, so let's stipulate that it's all true. They did what they were alleged to have done. What are they alleged to have done? Well, it's three-pronged for the most part. Number one, they had some Twitter trolls or bots who, were shit posting, to use the contemporary term, and causing kinds of, just doing trolling and whatever. You had Facebook memes that were posted that included stuff like a cartoon version of Bernie Sanders with a ripped chest and a Speedo. And you had Spearfish Gmail accounts. So John Podesta received a suspicious link that he very stupidly clicked on, and that resulted in his emails being exfiltrated. And what were in those emails? Well, it was a lot of genuinely newsworthy information. Cenk, to his credit, reported on it when they were released at the time. They revealed that, for example, the Clintons monetized the Clinton Foundation for the purposes of personal enrichment, which they had lied about for many years. It revealed that the DNC ended up merging operations with the Hillary Clinton campaign to the disadvantage of the Bernie Sanders campaign while the primaries were underway in 2016, in total contravention of their claimed neutrality. They revealed that top-level DNC officials plotted to do anti-Semitic smears against Bernie Sanders in southern state primaries, and that was part of the reason why the entire DNC executive committee resigned en masse on the eve of the Democratic convention in 2016. So this notion that all of that together in aggregate constitutes some kind of attack or can be distilled just into interference or something, I think it's totally unwarranted. You have Gerald Nadler, the representative from New York, who would have presided over impeachment hearings, going on MSNBC in 2018 and proclaiming that the Facebook memes and the Twitter trolls were tantamount to Pearl Harbor. Okay? So that's the level of hysteria we've dealt with. So, yeah, do I concede that it's plausible that they did some stuff? Sure. I'll even concede that there's a preponderance of evidence at this point that there was some Russian state actor involved in the hack of the DNC and Podesta, although we don't have the full trajectory of that established yet, as Matt Taibbi has pointed out. And we also don't know if a Russian state actor handed off that material to WikiLeaks. But so is that all worth losing our minds about? The fact that we received information, true information, about what the most powerful political factions in the country are doing in private. Remember, Hillary Clinton in 2016, and Zed, I know you remember this from the Intercept's coverage of it. Li Fang actually was very central in pushing this issue into the forefront. Hillary Clinton concealed her speech transcripts to Wall Street banks for months. She lied and said that she would, quote, look into releasing them. And how did we end up getting them? Well, through John Podesta's email leaks that were posted on WikiLeaks. So I'm glad we got that information, and I reject this notion that it can all be reduced to this notion of an attack on America or whatever the latest nomenclature is.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit more conflicted on that. And so on the one hand, the talk of Pearl Harbor is preposterous. I mean, that reminds me of Condoleezza Rice's reference to a mushroom cloud. And it is the Democrats definitely trying to protect their hide in saying if it wasn't for those dastardly kids, I would have gotten away with it, Scooby-Doo fashion. And I again, the MSNBC lionizing the John Brennans of the world, it's unconscionable. So those guys, in a lot of ways, covered up torture massively. James Clapper lied to Congress.
And by the way, Cenk, not just lionizing John Brennan, hiring him. They hired John Brennan.
I know. So people give me crap for hiring you and Jimmy Dore, et cetera. At least I didn't hire war criminals. No. Look, I know a lot of the anchors at MSNBC because I was an anchor there, and a lot of them are good people, but I'm profoundly disappointed in how they've dealt with this. And I've said a million times, look, this doesn't mean we should be more hostile to Russia. It's very important that we know what the president's motivations are and why he's making the decisions that he is. Even in times that I agree with him, I'm thrilled that we're withdrawing from Syria, but I still want to know what motivated Trump to do that. And if it was legitimate policy opinions, great. But if he's being influenced by a foreign government, even though I agree with that decision, I would be deeply troubled by that. So those are important distinctions. The reason I'm conflicted about the stuff coming out right before the election is we covered it all because of what Michael said. They're incredibly newsworthy. In a lot of ways, the mainstream media continue to cover up for the Democrats, and I think that the Young Turks had a very, very large role in breaking the Donna Brazil story. So obviously,
True.
WikiLeaks initially put it out in an email, but one of our reporters grabbed that email, highlighted it, publicized it, then went and asked Donna Brazil the question that got her into trouble in the first place, where she denied it. And in the beginning, the rest of the press, even with overwhelming evidence in the emails, was dismissive, like, oh, please, you Young Turks, saying that the beloved, esteemed Donna Brazil would leak questions. And then it turns out we were right. And she did leak questions, and she admitted it. So I'm proud of our role in bringing honesty and facts into that conversation. On the other hand, it does leave us in this weird situation where if any foreign government steals sensitive information and leaks it right before an election, we're in a damned if we do, damned if we don't situation. So let me give a different example. What if the Saudis or the Israelis or the Chinese, you fill in the blank, were to gain information about that was really damaging to fill in the blank here, whether it's Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or whoever it might be, and released it a week before the election, knowing that it would affect our elections? Well, then I feel like, God damn it, if you go along with it and you report it, it helps them accomplish their mission. On the other hand, it is incredibly newsworthy, and not reporting it is unconscionable. So that's why I feel that it merits having a mixed reaction to that.
Yeah, I think, and I think Glenn brought up this theoretical with you on the show, which is that let's stipulate theoretically, a hypothetical scenario. I don't know, some country like Venezuela, who's obviously very much opposed to Trump at this point because he's trying to overthrow their government. Say they hacked the Trump organization servers and got his tax returns. If they released those tax returns 2 weeks before the election and they were true and they were authenticated, would I as a journalist have a problem with that? No, I want Trump's tax returns. I want maximum transparency imposed on Donald Trump, right? So that would be my primary animating reaction to that sequence of events. And I think that's the same mindset I have vis-a-vis the WikiLeaks emails, because again, the entire media reported on them because they contained newsworthy information that would have otherwise been suppressed or concealed. But you mentioned these Syria withdrawals, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually also went and watched your segment on that from December 20th of last year. And while you did say that, yeah, we want to end these forever wars and our presence in Syria is disconcerting in many ways. We actually discussed this on one of our panel discussions in 2017. You posited in just a declaratory, matter-of-fact way that it was further evidence of Putin, quote, pulling the strings with regard to Trump. So it was more Manchurian candidate stuff in terms of why Trump issued that directive to withdraw troops from Syria. And you know why that's damaging? Because it sort of inhibits the ability of especially progressives who are watching your show in the main from dealing with the actual ramifications of a policy proposal like that, meaning withdrawing troops from Syria. Because if they're looking at it through the prism of Trump being controlled by the Kremlin, they're not going to analyze it on its own terms. They're not going to deal with the idea that we've had Obama initially sent boots on the ground to Syria. Obama, frankly lied about it. He said there would be no troops on the ground, and sure enough, because of mission creep, there was within due course. And Trump withdrawing them, I mean, if you just assume reflexively that it's due to his subservience to Putin, then of course you're going to look at that with extreme suspicion. And if the people that you're relying on for news and analysis, such as you or Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes or whoever, are telling them that you have to be inherently suspicious of this because it could just be further evidence of the Manchurian candidate theory, then it's gonna totally warp your ability to analyze the true consequences of America's forever wars. And that's what's so offensive to me. progressives and a large swaths of progressive and Democrats have totally missed the boat in terms of dealing with profound issues like this because they've been so consumed by the Russia mania, and it's infected how they view a wide variety of disparate issues. Most important being, I would say, these wars, and that's why I objected to your framing of that, and I still would.
I also want to just piggyback on that by saying that Trump has been very flattering towards people like Rodrigo Duterte as well as Putin. He's done, I would argue, Netanyahu. He's got an affinity for dictators, clearly. I would say that he's probably done far more to advance Kim Jong-un's interests in North Korea than he has Putin's agenda. But, we're not talking about those folks controlling Trump. So what is the difference? It seems to me that it's just Trump being Trump.
Yeah, so that's another interesting point. I hope I'll remember to get back to in a second. But that leads to the overall thing that I want to discuss here in regards to just the media side of it. Look, guys, that's why I object so much to us being lumped into the same category as MSNBC, because there are really important and massive differences. So when I criticize how deferential Donald Trump has been to Kim Jong-un, I add that every time I add that I'm glad that he's talking to him, that we should be having peace negotiations with the North Koreans, and that you don't get to negotiate with your friends, you have to negotiate with your enemies. And MSNBC makes no distinction when they say that when they talk about Syria. In fact, Brian Williams was, nearly wept as he saw how beautiful our bombs were that landed in Syria, which is, I know him a tiny bit personally too. He's a good guy. He's good to his family, etc. But that's gross. And we don't do that. We say we want negotiations. We want to withdraw from Syria. Super important distinctions. But I cannot bury the other parts of the story. So why am I concerned about whether Trump is acting on the level in regards to Syria is that one of those famous no translator meetings with Putin happened a couple of weeks before Trump decided that he was going to withdraw from Syria. Now, you could say on the one hand, it was a stated position of his several years ago. On the other hand, he hadn't really gone in that direction at all. And then lightning out of blue strikes, and he says, okay, in a tweet, that's it, I'm getting out of Syria. And so I think it's okay to say that I agree with that policy while questioning why he did it. If just because I agree with the policy, if I buried Trump's motivation on it that I was legitimately concerned about, I also would not be doing justice to our audience. And in terms of my analysis and my role within the media, right, and the Young Turks overall, we're not straight journalists in the sense of just the facts, ma'am. What we do is we give the facts first, and we don't shade the facts, and we never, ever lie about the facts like Fox News does, or arguably the alternative facts of the mainstream media. But then we do give our perspective and analysis. And so I'll give you an example from the past. Mark Sanford said he was on the Appalachian Trail and that when he was governor of South Carolina and he was missing. I came on the air and said, bullshit. There is no governor that goes on the Appalachian Trail and doesn't tell his staff and is incommunicado. That is not what happened. Why did I say that? Now, strictly by the Michael Tracey standard, you should not say that. You should say, well, until proven otherwise, the governor's on the Appalachian Trail. No, but part of our job is in some forms of journalism, and in my case, perspective journalism, is to give analysis. That is not what happens normally in American political life. There's a different story here. And of course, I was right about that. He was having an affair in Argentina with his mistress. And there's sometimes that I have made those analysis that have proven to be incorrect. For example, I found it unbelievable to think that Anthony Weiner, a relatively intelligent congressman, would actually send dick pics through Twitter. But it turns out he did. So I was wrong about that. And I immediately admitted it as soon as the facts were in. It doesn't help me or the audience or anyone to hang on to things that you were wrong about. In this case, the jury is not remotely in. And the reason that I gave the analysis that I did is I can cite more, but I think you guys get it from all the things that I've cited in earlier parts of the conversation. There are no coincidences so large as the one in the server situation. There are no, hey, I don't want any American translators in a meeting because I'm not talking about compromising stuff that I don't want anybody to find out. There are no secret meetings in the Seychelles Island because they want to talk about their health or charity. And so that is, I think, very fair perspective to give the audience without then jumping into the MSNBC train and going, let's go bomb Russia or Syria.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up that Brian Williams incident where he infamously, almost teared up live on air at the beauty of these strikes in Syria. And he said, this is the day that Trump became president or something to that effect. I mean, that was as gross a spectacle as you'll ever see. But you know what's also gross, in my opinion? Lending progressive, quote unquote, legitimization or credence to a 3-year narrative that is essentially at its core a militaristic conspiracy theory spawned by the security state apparatus, so the FBI and the CIA. That to me is gross because you know what progressives should be insisting upon? That extreme skepticism be applied to FBI and CIA claims. That we not just mindlessly regurgitate the establishment narratives being fed to us by CNN and MSNBC. You know, Cenk, I just reviewed some of the YouTube title headlines going back 9 months because that's all the YouTube kind of search function allowed on the main show of the Young Turks. And there are just some of them that are so incendiary as to lead me to believe that they're just totally irresponsible. Now, I know that the exigencies of headline creation is that you want it to be as kind of salacious as possible and you want people to click, right? But those are the same kinds of commercial incentives that the corporate media works within. So I would hope that an outlet like the Young Turks would have a different approach. So, for example, September 14th, 2018, here's the headline on the Young Turks video. Paul Manafort is a Russian puppet. Totally untrue. That's just not true. Mueller indicted Paul Manafort on a variety of charges, none of which had to do with anything about him being a Russian puppet. Okay? June 8th, 2018, Putin owns Trump. OWNS in all caps. Again, if you believe the Manchurian candidate theory, okay, fine. But I think at the very least, that's an extreme and irresponsible oversimplification of the matter. March 6, 2017, top Trump advisor accidentally admits WikiLeaks back channel. Again, false. Roger Stone, who that title was referring to, had no such back channel with WikiLeaks, and that's been demonstrated by the indictment that was issued by Mueller against him in January when actually it was disproven the notion that Roger Stone had any privileged access to WikiLeaks materials. He was just trying to puff himself up and bullshitting, essentially, when, again, he had no privileged access to WikiLeaks emails. And then also you have stuff like August 16th, 2017, prediction, Trump will resign in disgrace soon. I mean, Cenk, that's where you said that you can, quote, write it down in stone that Trump would resign, you said probably within 6 months, but at most within 18 months. And now it's been 20 months and Trump has not resigned. Not only has he not resigned, he's been empowered because he's been given grounds to legitimately claim vindication because of the media malfeasance, because of the Democrats' self-delusion. And impeachment or resignation is as far off a prospect as ever before. So just in total, you've conveyed a false impression to your readership and viewership about this story. And I think that you ought to accept responsibility for that rather than claiming this arbitrary distinction between yourself and like a Rachel Maddow type, because as you've said, you are even more invested in the Manchurian candidate theory than Rachel. And Rachel's like the most egregious emblem of this conspiratorial insanity in the entire media. So that's why I think that this has really been damaging, and I would hope that we can honestly self-reflect and deal with the craziness that's been allowed to proliferate here.
Michael, you continue to assume things not in evidence. So if you want to criticize the titling of some of our videos, and of all those that you read, maybe there was 1.5 issue, but the others I do believe. That's not me. And I know people will say, I don't care. 70, 80 people might work at the Young Turks, but you're responsible for every single thing that every single one of them does. Okay, you run a company, see how you like
it. But Cenk, those are the titles on your own videos, like in which you are featured.
Hey, Michael, you know that there's publishers that do the titling, right? Having nothing to do with me. And that if I try to manage every title of everything, then I would be a publisher at the Young Turks instead of a host and CEO of the Young Turks. And then there are people on the network that I don't agree with, but I don't control them. There's, literally, I cannot do 80 jobs at once. So if you're going to criticize me for a couple of titles over a 3-year period, all right, fine. Okay,
But that's not all I'm criticizing you for, Cenk. I mentioned many, many other things that I'm criticizing you for. That's just one bit of it. And you know what? If my work or my journalism or my analysis was being presented consistently under titles that were falsely representing my beliefs or conveying a false impression, I would object.
You're cherry picking at most 2 titles out of literally thousands upon thousands. And you're saying you should stop doing all other work and just edit titles so you don't get 2 wrong, if that's even true, out of the thousands that you put up in a couple of years. Again, insane standard, and I don't accept it. So in terms of the predictions, there you go. That's something that is right to criticize me on. And I'm often wrong on the timing of the predictions, and I say that on air all the time. We joke around about it on the air all the time. And I would say literally out of all the predictions that I have made, you go back and you seem to have a penchant for looking through old videos. Great, please do that, because you will see that 9 out of 10 times I am right in a record that is unbelievably better than the pundits on television who don't look at polling, don't look at the facts, etc. The Anthony Weiner thing is an interesting exception that proves the rule. But on the other hand, look, my whole career is admitting when I'm wrong. I started out as a Republican, so it's not like I'm shy about doing that. And I very publicly talk about the policy issues that I have changed on and why I got them wrong. But you keep assuming that Trump has no connections to the Russians, and we just discussed for well over an hour here that we disagree on that issue. And I gave you all the reasons why we disagree on it, and you keep going back to it like I'm right, so why don't you apologize? Preposterous. I'll do no such thing. The thing that I'm on the predictions, obviously wrong on the timing of when Trump leaves. Do I believe that Trump will not resign and will carry out his term? No, I'm not at all certain of that. So if you want to say, "Oh, that's funny, that's crazy," I don't believe that. Fine, and I'm not positive at this point that he's going to be out before his term. But is that still possible? Definitely. They still have Alan Weisselberg, who was the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. I would be shocked beyond imagination if Donald Trump did not commit any criminal business dealings in his time running the Trump Organization. And so my guess is he committed a ton of financial crimes, and yes, some linked to Russia, as we have been discussing. And could that still come out before his term is over? Yes. Is the window starting to close on it? Yes. So I do not withdraw that analysis, but on the timing that's wrong, that's obvious and clear. So I'm not wedded to stuff that I have said on ego, but I will stick with the things that I believe to be true, and I will not be bullied into admitting into facts that are not in evidence.
It is in evidence that you said you can, quote, write it down in stone that he would leave within the time period that you specified. I know. I'm saying, but that is in evidence, and I'm glad that you acknowledge that that was wrong. By the way, I also agree that there's a distinct possibility that Trump leaves office before the conclusion of the second of the term. I think that's fine to say. I'm just not making a definitive proclamation and saying write it down in stone. I'm more evidence based.
Except when the evidence is inconvenient to your theory, in which case you diminish it or completely ignore it. Whereas I'm saying, look, in fact, here I'll go back to the point brought up by Leighton and Zed at different times. I think it's interesting counter theory that Trump is so enamored with dictators and definitely enamored by anyone who compliments him. And that perhaps that's a counter theory as to why he's so deferential to Vladimir Putin. Putin is smart enough to say, "Hey, nice hair," and Trump's like, "Oh, I love this guy. I love him," right? And he thinks that the Russians did help him in the elections, which they did, again, marginally, as we discussed earlier. And so that might be a reason why he's overly deferential to Putin. And so I acknowledge that, and I think that's interesting, and I can't wait to see what's true and not true. while I give analysis based on the evidence that we have. Whereas, you're charging me with certain things, and I would charge back that whatever is inconvenient to you in terms of evidence, you immediately ignore or diminish, which I don't think is necessarily "quote unquote"
Well,
fact-based.
I think I've attempted to address every piece of supposedly inconvenient evidence that you've put to me, and if I haven't, I'm happy to do so now. Here's another reason why all this has been so pernicious, right? So I think back to this book tour that Andrew McCabe was on recently. He was the deputy director of the FBI who became acting director once Trump fired Comey in May 2017. And Andrew McCabe has now been running around saying about how virtuous it was that he opened this investigation on Trump to determine whether he was, quote, a national security threat. And when pressed, Andrew McCabe says and admits that there was no insider information which led him to conclude that there was reasonable suspicion to believe that Trump was a national security threat. Rather, the idea was that Trump was taking foreign policy actions that were so outside the consensus that it troubled him to the degree that he would open up this unprecedented investigation on the democratically elected president. And in fact, he and Rod Rosenstein contemplated, quote, wearing a wire on Trump in the Oval Office and actually also invoking the 25th Amendment to remove him. So these are the senior-most law enforcement officials in the federal apparatus contemplating these staggering, again, unprecedented tactics to depose the president. And for that to have all gotten progressive legitimacy throughout this entire disgusting saga is really, really troubling. And here's why. Bernie Sanders, I think, is the likeliest person to be the next president. I think he's the front runner for 2020. I think he has an extremely powerful base of support, and that he's got, as I'm sure Cenk would probably agree, a very, very good chance of winning the entire ballgame. So now you have a precedent enshrined, precedent with a C, which says that if the federal members of the federal law enforcement apparatus, whether it's the CIA or the FBI or what have you, NSA, if they, on their own accord, if they unilaterally determine that Bernie Sanders should be investigated because of some, ostensibly unconventional foreign policy action he's taken, they can cite what went on during the Trump period, and they can invoke the progressive credibility that was attributed to those actions as justification for for what they choose to do. And I think that's a tragedy. That's going to have long-lasting implications for, conceivably the rest of American history. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but I think it's accurate. And for progressives to have, and the Young Turks, Democracy Now!, all these other outlets, Mother Jones, to have not reckoned or grappled with any of this because they're so motivated overwhelmingly by their blinding hatred of Trump, I think is a real tragedy. And I'm despondent about it. I'm angry about it. And that's why I've been on my mini crusade here to try to impose accountability, because we want a healthy media and politics in this country. And the past 3 years have been anything but healthy. In fact, they've been extraordinarily corrosive and harmful. And I hope that progressive media in particular will accept their share of the blame for it.
So my concluding thoughts are that, again, I can't help but address some of the things that Michael said. On the McCabe investigations, if you really believe they started it because they didn't like Trump, then it sounds like you're saying that you believe Trump, that it was a witch hunt and a hoax. And I don't believe that at all. I believe that they were legitimately concerned that a foreign government had influence on the elections and on one of the candidates. If they investigate Bernie Sanders because they don't like him, that would be disastrous. And I've said that. But if they had evidence that the Chinese are secretly controlling Bernie Sanders, as a patriotic American, I would want that investigated, assuming that that investigation is honest. When it comes to the 25th Amendment, I've also been clear about that. I said, look, this is a dangerous road to go down because the minute they don't like Bernie Sanders, they're going to say, well, he's old. We did the 25th Amendment on Trump. Come on, let's get rid of him as well, Bernie. But on the other hand, the guy talks about the oranges of the investigation and then refused to acknowledge that he misspoke in a way that makes you think he's covering things up. He said Covfefe was a secret message to people. What? and he believes that wind causes cancer. The guy is mentally unstable. Clearly, the emperor has no clothes. Every day he says three things that are mentally unbalanced. He screamed into Twitter, "I'm known for two things in life. One is being like he said on Twitter, wrote down, like a really smart person, and being mentally stable." Who brags that one of the things they're known for is mental stability? Only a lunatic does that. So I think the 25th Amendment is a very real conversation about a guy who either never had a mind to lose in the first place or has really begun to lose it in a very serious and concerning way. But unlike your charge, Michael, we do nuance, and we do give those distinctions and those caveats when we do those stories. And what I'm worried about is the converse of what you're worried about, which is that when you and others are perceived to be screaming from the rooftops, "Trump is innocent, Trump is innocent, Trump is innocent," it gives off the impression that Trump is innocent about everything, that we should stop investigating whether he did campaign finance violations, the clear felony. Trump University is an obvious scam that any other person would go to prison for. They're using Trump charity money for your own benefit and legal bills. Any other person would go to prison for. So, and I'm afraid that you are helping the Republican and Trump cause and saying, wrap it up, don't ever investigate Trump about anything. I know you're not saying that, but you certainly are giving off that impression. And I'm deeply worried about that when we have a president who I think is a lifelong criminal, deeply mentally unstable, and should definitely not be above the law.
So I've never once shouted Trump is innocent of everything, and never even remotely given that impression. I, in this very conversation, gave you examples of things that I think Trump is guilty of, and I'll give you more now. Prolonging the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, becoming subservient to the Republican donor class in contravention of his promises in 2016, overthrowing the government of Venezuela without ample basis. Attacking Syria repeatedly in terms of bombing the Syrian airfield on 2 separate occasions. I could go on and on and on. He's obviously corrupt. My point from the very outset has been the opposition to Trump has to be evidence-based. It has to be rational. It can't be mired in these delusional conspiratorial fantasies, because that ultimately empowers Trump. And we have evidence now that it hasn't, in fact, empowered Trump, because he's claiming vindication, and he's rightly pointing to examples of utter media malfeasance that give credence to his proclaiming fake news. So yes, Trump is not innocent of everything, not by any stretch, but we want to actually marshal the stuff that he's truly guilty of instead of these fairy tales that have been so dominant for 3 years. And that, again, is tragic.
All right. My last point will be very quick. When you put in loaded terms like conspiracy theory, you know what you're doing, Michael. So we have different view and perspective and analysis of the issues which we just spent a good deal of time discussing. So I could reverse it on you and say it's a funny conspiracy theory you have that Trump is acting like a normal president and having normal relationships with Vladimir Putin. What a hilarious, weirdo conspiracy theory based on emotion. These are kind of the words that you've used.
No, Cenk, I'm not saying conspiracy theory as a pejorative. I'm saying it literally, because if you're saying that there's collusion, that is, in literal terms, you're positing the existence of a conspiracy, meaning people conspired with one another to achieve a corrupt outcome. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not using it as to be derisive.
No, yes, except you are. Glenn and I had this conversation 2 days ago too. I get that you're saying, hey, I'm just saying it literally, but everybody knows that that term is used in normal political parlance as derisive. So anyway, it's okay, because we at least took a long time here to hash out what our real thoughts are, and folks can judge for themselves what they view to be our positions and the facts as we know them.
And again, Cenk, I really appreciate you doing it. It's more than a lot of people in media would do. So again, I commend you sincerely.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate both of you guys coming on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think this was a good model for people to be able to sit down and talk to each other. So we both really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for putting it together too. And thank you, Michael.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so that was something. Subscribe on Patreon, subscribe on YouTube, do all that kind of stuff. Oh, you can also subscribe now on iTunes, so that's now available. And I need another cigarette. I do not smoke. So there you go. See you next time.